Hi there folks, in today's demonstration I'm going to walk you through how to build a Power Automate Cloud Flow with either the Graph API or the SharePoint REST API, which are closely connected, to obtain the site ID, the drive ID, the item ID, and ultimately enable you to delete the file or folder of your choice using dynamic values like a document library name or a site name. So this will talk you through step by step, compare both options, and you'll learn not only how to build out that flow, but you'll learn lots of tips and tricks throughout the video. So without further ado, let's jump into the demonstration. So I'm going to start off today's video from my blog post, and it's just to demonstrate I have documented this process, how to get the site ID, the item ID, the drive ID, and ultimately how to delete the file or folder using the Graph API. You can also use the equivalent SharePoint REST API, and I'm going to demonstrate that now. So starting from the top of my blog post, you'll see that I have an example URL, and this allows me to get the ID of a site. So if I copy that and jump across onto Graph Explorer, I can go and paste in that URL and then make a few changes. So at the moment, I've got my tenant name in there. I know my tenant is Aberdeen Demo Dev, and then my site name, in this case I put in Damien Bird. I've actually created a SharePoint site here called June 2024, and we can also see that in the URL at the top. So it's this document library, which is called another document library. It isn't my default document library, and I'm wanting to be able to delete files and folders within this structure. So back over onto Graph, if I update Damien Bird with June 2024 and simply run that query, you'll see I get all okay, and there are a few different parameters that come back in the body. And within that, we have the site ID, and that's incredibly important for the next stage. Jumping back onto my blog, if we go and copy the next Graph statement here and copy that, we can then obtain the drive ID. So over onto Graph, if I go and paste in that URL that I've got there, I want to overwrite this GUID here with the GUID that I have captured from below, the site ID. So if I copy the site ID from below, I can then paste that into the URL above and then run the query, and we'll get the next stage. And you can see now I've brought back the two document libraries that are currently on this site. Now the good thing is this is completely dynamic, so if you have multiple document libraries, you'll see that we have the name of the document library, and if you're thinking ahead and thinking about Power Automate, which we will build later on in this video, you could then filter on the name of the document library to get the next value, which is the ID of our particular drive. So the third step is to obtain the item ID of that drive. So if I copy again this URL, jump over onto Graph, I can paste that in, and this time things are getting a bit more complicated. First of all, I need to insert that ID for the drive ID, and if I use my Windows and V, I can pick that out from earlier. I then need to go and replace this item ID here, so I can copy this ID here, and then I can overwrite it in the URL. Then the final thing is you'll see it's got /root, and then there is the folder path. So that's completely different from the folder path that I have on my SharePoint document library. If I jump across there, I have, first of all, a folder called Delete Me, then a folder called I'm Nested. So if we jump across here and say Delete Me, and then another one called I'm Nested, you can see that when I run this, it will then give me back the ID of this folder. What happens if I want the ID of a particular file? Well, jumping across into this I'm Nested, I have a file here called a nested doc.docx. Jumping back onto Graph, if I type in a nested doc.docx and run this, you'll see that we now get the ID of that particular file, a nested doc.docx. And with that ID, we can now delete the file or do as we please. Now, the interesting thing about all this is that the SharePoint REST API and the Graph API are actually closely related, and you can call these equivalent REST API calls on the SharePoint REST, which I'll now go on to demonstrate. In fact, there is a link on my blog, and if you click on that, it will show you how we have these similarities. And ultimately, you should be going down the route of Graph API if you're doing lots of Microsoft 365 related queries. But if you're going down the route of just SharePoint only, then technically you could just use the SharePoint HTTP action in Power Automate if you just want to act as a delegated user. So if we take a look at that query again on the Graph Explorer, if I copy everything after sites here, Control C, I'm going to jump across onto SharePoint. I'm going to strip back the URL here and put _API and then version 2.0 and then paste in the rest of that URL that I copied. If I now hit enter, you'll see that in the browser I've performed a get REST API call and I have got back the ID of that particular document. So we can call the same API calls on the SharePoint REST API in a browser, but what that means is ultimately we can do exactly the same thing in Power Automate. Now the only curious thing I'm going to call out is we have a version 2.0. There is actually a version 2.1. I've not yet found it in documentation, but if I change that to 2.1 and hit return, you'll see I get exactly the same information back. And it looks like in Power Automate 2.0 is not supported, but 2.1 is. So that brings me over nicely to Power Automate, where I'm now going to build a flow to run both the Graph API calls and the SharePoint REST API calls side by side. But before I get started, what I really want to do is to define a series of variables, because I need to define the tenant, the site name, the document library name, and the file or folder path. And by making these dynamic, it means that you can use this across any scenario that you can possibly think of. So I would normally use a compose, but I thought I'd demonstrate something a bit different with a parse JSON. So we can use a parse JSON to define our object structure for some variables. If you don't feel comfortable with this, then you can go ahead and define some variables as you see fit. But I need to define, first of all, a tenant, which I'm going to leave blank at the moment. I need to define a site name. Again, I'll leave blank. I need a document library name, because of course I demonstrated that this is not on the default document library, albeit it could, but it will allow you to filter and use any document library dynamically. And then finally, is it a file or a folder path that we need to delete? And again, I will leave that blank, but that gives us a nice object structure, and we can use this to then create a schema. So if I copy that and use this payload, I can paste it in, hit done, and we now have a payload that will allow me to call these different values dynamically across the rest of my flow. So I'm just going to go and fill out these different parameters for the tenant, site name, document library name, and the folder path. Here we have my tenant. My site was called June 24. My document library was called another document library. And then my folder path was delete me, I'm nested. And of course that could be a file or a folder path. So back into Power Automate, we can now look to introduce the HTTP calls for both Graph and SharePoint, because I promised I'd run both of them side by side. So I'll search for HTTP. In this case, I want to get the Entra ID, invoke an HTTP request, but it's the pre-authorized. So not this one, but in fact this one here. So this will allow me to run as a user, and that user will have to have access to that site as an owner or site collection admin. But we're going to use a get, and then we need to get the path for that particular URL. Now it's worth noting that I've already created a connection. If I jump across onto my blog, you'll see that when you create a new connection, you will be requested to specify the base URL and the Entra ID URL. You can use graph.microsoft.com, and that will allow your end user to authenticate with that and use the Graph API for whatever permissions they have as a user. So back to the top of that blog post, I have this URL. This is where we're going to start. So I'll copy that, jump over onto Power Automate, and if I paste that in here, the things that I need to update are based on these variables that I set in parse JSON. So the tenant name we need to make dynamic, so I'll use that tenant variable there from the parse JSON, and the other thing is the site name. So again, I'll highlight that there and replace that with a dynamic value for the site name. Now I promised I was going to run the SharePoint one, so let's run it side by side. We'll add in a parallel branch and we'll search for the SharePoint HTTP. And we'll send an HTTP request to SharePoint. So here we're going to use the root site, so what's traditionally the intranet, so no other sites after that URL. And then we're going to do a get also, but if we jump back onto this Graph API one, I want to copy everything after the graph.microsoft.com, copy that, jump back to the SharePoint paste that in, but then we need to make some slight changes. So the way that we run the API for SharePoint is you need to put a /_API, a /, and then rather than it being version 1, we saw earlier, it's version 2.0, or as I discovered in Power Automate, version 2.1. But if we test that now, we can see that the flow completes successfully, and on the HTTP request or graph, in there we can see our SharePoint Site ID that we saw earlier. If I look at the SharePoint one, it's exactly the same. We have that site ID being returned here. So both of these actions have returned exactly the same data. If I click on the graph, you can see the site ID. If I click on the SharePoint, you can see the site ID. It's also exactly the same structure as well. So we have a body. In that body, we have SharePoint IDs, and we want to get the site ID. So this is very important for also writing expressions. So the next stage is to call another HTTP call, and maybe the easiest way to do this is to copy the action, to then paste it in here, and we'll do the same with the SharePoint. I'll copy it and I will paste it in. I'll rename these because rather than getting the site ID this time, we'll be getting the drive ID. So get drive ID, and same here too. But if we work with the graph version first, jump back onto my blog, we can grab that sample URL from here, Control C, over onto here, we'll paste it in. Now we have to get this ID dynamically in order to call this API call. If I bring across my notepad, I copied the output from the history. We saw that we had SharePoint IDs and then site ID. So it's this value here that we want to get. We could do a parse JSON, but I'm going to show you how to write an expression. So with this selected, if we go into FX, we're going to go into dynamic content first of all, because we want to get the body, and that body will give us that full response. And then what we want to do is we want to use a question mark, square brackets and single quotes, SharePoint IDs, and then / site ID. Again, if I bring across the notepad, the reason I'm writing that is this data that I've got here is from the body of the HTTP action above. And then I want to get the SharePoint IDs, which is this first part here. Because it's an object in these squiggly brackets, I don't have to worry about it being a first or anything like that. I just want to get the site ID. So I can put / site ID, and that'll allow me to get the site ID. So I can hit add, and that's that expression complete. Now when it comes to our SharePoint one, again, I can copy this bit of the URL. I can jump across here and we can paste that in. Of course, we need to make the update so that we have the _API / and we'll have 2.1. This expression here is currently relying on the wrong action. So rather than it being the body of the graph, I want it to be the body of the send an HTTP request. You see I've just updated that there, but the path is exactly the same. SharePoint IDs / site ID. I can update that and we can save and test. So if we scroll down and have a look at the output, we'll be able to find in the body here the drive ID, which I'll just go ahead and highlight. And if I jump into the equivalent on SharePoint, magically it's highlighted also. So again, in the body we have that ID. And once more, I'm going to copy this and use it for later, because we'll need to write an expression to get the value of that drive ID, remembering that this is actually giving us the IDs of all of our document libraries. In this case, we have documents and also another document library. So we're now going to have to filter this based on the document library that we're looking to get the ID for. So because we need to filter, I'm going to add in a filter array, and we'll do this for both sides. So this is the filter array for the graph. I'll add in one on the right hand side as well. So for the graph, in terms of the input, we want to use the body from the get drive IDs, and then we simply want to filter the name of the data source. So if I bring across again the data source that comes back in the body, this is the body, this value here that we're referring to. We want to check, does the name equal the name of the document library that we've defined in our parse JSON or in our variable. So over here in the filter query, we want to write an expression, item, open close brackets, that refers to everything, but we want to just compare the name. So the reason I've chosen name is because we have this value here, the name. And it's at this point I've realized that I've actually inserted the wrong value. It's not the body is this whole thing. We're actually wanting to look at the body value. So if you ever see body or body value is obviously referring to this array. Body is referring to everything here. So actually I need to modify this from so that it is the body value. So first of all, I'll hit add so we get the item name in there. I'm going to remove the body. Go back into FX this time, choose a dynamic content, choose the body because there isn't a body value, and at the end I just need to insert value in single quotes and square brackets. I put in a question mark. That just means if it's not found it will return null. So we'll hit add. That is our filter almost complete. We just need to go into our dynamic content now and get our document library name, and all we're doing here is we're filtering the value array that comes back from our drive ID, where the name is equal to the document library name that we specified in our variable above. And we'll just repeat that now over here. So into FX, into dynamic content, we'll choose the body from the drive ID, but I'll change that to include value like so, because it's the value array. And then over in the filter query into FX, item, open close, and then our square brackets with name, and we'll hit add, and then of course we'll use the dynamic value for the name of our document library, and we'll save and test. So with the flow complete, if we have a look at first of all the input, we can see that there are 2 document libraries in this case, and if we scroll down, the output is based on another document library because we've filtered that array, so we now only have that 1 document library. Similarly, on the right hand side, again, we have got the 2 as inputs here, and then in the output we have another document library, and it's now this ID that we want to retrieve for our next action. So just like before, I'm going to copy the action and I will paste it in, and I'll do the same for SharePoint and paste that in also. The next stage is to get the item ID, so we'll just rename them there to item ID, and the same for this one here. I'm going to jump across onto my blog here, and rather than copying this whole URL, I'm going to copy from this point onwards so that I don't upset the original expression that I have for the dynamic site ID, because it's the drive ID that I now need to get dynamically, but we've already got the site ID. So I'll copy this to my clipboard. I'll jump back across into Power Automate. I don't want to overwrite this site ID, but what I will do is I'll copy from drives onwards and paste in, and then all I need to do is to update this ID, which will come from our filter array. Now the filter array is an array, which means we could have one or many different results, but there should only be one result because we filtered based on the document library name. So we're going to use an expression, and we're going to get the first result back from our filter array body. So into dynamic content we can use the filter array body, and of course we need to get the ID, and this is where I'm going to bring up the sample data to remind ourselves. The filter array is going to be an array, albeit it will be one item. In this case it will be this object here, still in an array, but we want to get the ID. So in order to write an expression, we put at the end here in square brackets ID, and that will get us the first ID back from our filter array. So I can go ahead and add that in there. Now the next thing to update is the folder path. So this piece here is currently for a fixed folder path. If I go into my dynamic content, we set the body file or folder path, and so that allows us to create that dynamically and pull that through and get the ID of this particular item, which could be a file or a folder. So like before, I'm going to copy this, but I'm going to copy from drives onwards. So I'll Control C, jump across onto the SharePoint, Control V, but of course I need to update this. This is not based on the filter array of graph, is based on the filter array of SharePoint. So we can override that with the filter array of SharePoint like so. I can update that, and then when it comes to the body file content, that's perfect. It's come from parse.json, so that's correct. So one modification to make from that copy, just making sure that you're pointing to the first ID from the filter array for SharePoint. And again, let's save and test. So with the flow complete, if I again look at the outputs, we can scroll to the bottom, look at the body, and this is the final piece we're looking for. This is the ID of the particular path. In this case, it is I'm nested. Similarly, over on the SharePoint, again, if I scroll down to the outputs, we can see in the body this ID, and it's this ID that we can use for the last piece to delete the file or do whatever else we need as required. So the final piece is just to delete that file or folder. I'm going to again copy the actions, paste them in, and we will call it delete file or folder. I'll do the same with SharePoint, copy that, and we can paste it in. If we jump back across onto my blog post, we can see that in order to delete that file or folder, I'm using drives and then the item that comes through dynamically. So I'm just going to modify this URL this time round. I don't need this SharePoint dynamic value. I don't need sites. It's all based on drives, which I've got here. And then afterwards, I'm going to delete everything, insert items / and then I need to get the dynamic value for the item ID from the action above. So into FX, into dynamic content, I want to get the body. But if I bring up my notepad, we can see that the value that I need to get from the body, this is the body from the action above when I looked at the history, I want to get the ID, this value here, it's called ID. So over in Power Automate, question mark, square brackets, single quotes, and ID, and that will let me get the ID. The other thing to note is I need to change the method to delete, because of course I want to delete that file or folder. The SharePoint one is exactly the same idea. Again, I'm going to modify the URL, remove the dynamic value there for the site, keep the drive and the drive ID, remove everything afterwards, insert items / and then into FX, dynamic content, get the body for that item ID, and similarly add in a question mark, square bracket, single quotes, and ID, like so. And that'll allow us to pass through the ID from above. Now, the only thing to mention or note is that these are running in parallel, so they're both going to try and delete the folder path that I have specified here. Delete me, I'm nested. And if I look at this document library, I have delete me, I'm nested. So this and the file within the folder should be deleted. But because they're running in parallel, I'm also going to get one of them to delete this file called doc2delete. So that's part of the delete me folder, doc2delete.docx. So what that means is at the point where I have the get item ID and I currently have a fixed path based on my parse JSON, I'm going to remove that and insert the folder called delete me and doc2delete.docx. And what that'll mean is the SharePoint side will delete one file, the graph side will delete a folder, and we'll demonstrate both deleting a file and also deleting a folder and everything nested within that folder. So we'll save and test. So as we can see, both sides have completed. If we go to the graph side, it has deleted an ID that is this one here, which will be the folder path. And if we have a look at the SharePoint one, it will have deleted a different ID, in which case we have this ID here. But the proof is, jumping over onto SharePoint, if I refresh, we can see that the nested folder and all the related files underneath it have disappeared and are probably in my recycle bin. There we go, I'm nested. But if I jump back, my doc2delete is still there. Why is that? Well, if I jump back onto my send an HTTP request for SharePoint, I believe I will have probably kept it as a method get. There we go. So because it's a method get, it's not a delete, it's not deleted the file, it will have brought back lots of parameters about that particular file rather than deleting it. So just to test or prove that, if I switch this to a delete and test, what will now happen is the left-hand side will fail because of course the folder path for the original folder that we deleted no longer exists. But the one on the right hand side will pass because it will delete the file rather than just getting all the associated metadata based on that item ID. And there we have it. Left hand side has failed. It's not able to get the item ID for that folder path because it no longer exists. But on the right hand side, the delete method has completed. And if we jump back onto my SharePoint document library, the file has already disappeared and has landed in my recycle bin. And there you have it. You've learned how to use either the Graph API or the SharePoint REST API as a user to delete files or folders. Of course, you could turn this into a custom connector, make some of this even more repeatable if there are lots of people in your organization looking to do this. And that's a video that I could potentially build, but equally you might have a situation where rather than a user having access to a SharePoint site, you might want to have an application that has access to all sites as a site collection administrator. So that's something that also, again, I could cover. If you're interested, please let me know in the comments. And as always, thanks very much for watching, and I hope to see you again sometime soon. Cheers.